Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for joining us. I did say people kept on asking, where's Tap gone? Where's Tap gone? And I always said we will be back, inshallah. So we are back. Slightly different format to our normal shows. So normally we have a panel of brothers, we do a live show. This is not the same type of show. Those shows, instead, what we've got is we're going to have a series of interviews, discussions, presentations on particular topic areas. The other brothers haven't gone anywhere, but alhamdulillah, they are busy with other aspects of the dawah that they're doing. So, inshallah, when they are free and available, they will also be joining our streams as well, inshallah. But we wanted to try to bring on expert guests, have in-depth discussions and presentations on various topics related to Islam, belief, theology, ideology, philosophy, etc. So in light of that, we have today's stream. Today's stream is going to be a discussion about the critique of secularism, going into a little bit more depth. Alhamdulillah, we have a very special guest that I'm very happy and pleased that has agreed to come on and provide a presentation for us. His name is Ali Harfouch. Ali Harfouch is a brother I've known for a number of years now. Alhamdulillah, he actually he came to the UK, and I was fortunate enough to visit or to meet up with him when he came here. He has a master's in politics, in political science at the American University of Beirut, where he's also been a lecturer there as well. He's written numerous articles, papers, and he's also undertaking or delivering a course for the Sapiens Institute. And really, this presentation is a way to sort of give you a teaser to that Sapiens Institute course. So let me bring him up. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having
How are
me.
you, Ali?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, good, good. Jazakallah khair for coming on.
Walaikum.
Appreciate that. So I
Walaikum.
mentioned that you're giving this course on the Sapiens Institute. Is it the course been delivered, or is it
It's been recorded. It's being uploaded, inshallah.
You're right. So for them to then to watch the course, they would just need to sign up from the Sapiens Institute. Is that
Exactly.
correct? Yeah.
Exactly.
Alhamdulillah. So, Alhamdulillah, Ali, inshallah, he's going to be giving a presentation. While the presentation is running, if I've got any points that I want to add or any questions, I'm going to raise that, inshallah, with him. Is any like introductory remarks that you want to mention, Ali, now?
No,
Or
no. Just that this is part. I mean, this is part of the presentation. So if anybody wants a more comprehensive critique of secularism, they can refer to the course. I'm only going to be taking snippets in this presentation, inshallah.
Yeah, like I mentioned, this is just a teaser to the full course. So I encourage all the brothers out there to, if interested in this topic area, essential aspects in order to understand this topic area as well, to go to the Sapiens Institute and check out Ali Harfouch's course on this topic. So I'm gonna add the presentation to the stream, inshallah, and then when you're ready, you can take it from there. I don't know if you need me to change the
No, no, I
slide.
can do it. I
Oh,
can do
okay,
it.
excellent. Alhamdulillah. So, inshallah, whenever you're ready.
Okay, inshallah. So to begin with, when we engage in a critique of secularism, what we need is a framework, right? We need a series of concepts and ideas through which we can approach the idea of secularism and what comes to be called secularism. Now, the standard narrative that is put forth by secularism or by secular thinkers is what we call the subtraction thesis, which is essentially the idea that man has transitioned into a state of maturity, beginning with superstition to religion to the secular, as though this was some sort of inevitable natural process. And really, the whole idea of secularism is premised on a binary, that being these two mutually exclusive categories, one of which is religion, and the other of which is the secular, and what comes to be known as essentially what is the political. So these two categories are treated as though they are universal and as though they are mutually exclusive. Now, this is precisely what we need to critique. This is precisely the terms on which secularism should be approached and dissected. How do we go about doing so? The framework that I propose we employ is a framework that has been put forth by the cultural anthropologist Talal Asad. And the point that he makes is that to understand secularism, we must first understand the secular. And the secular is an epistemic category. And in order to fully articulate a critique of secularism, or to try to understand how secularism has come to be what it is, we need to engage in a genealogy of the secular, which is, according to Assad, a way of working back from the present to the contingencies that have come together to give us our certainties. Those certainties, for example, being the commonsensical binary of the religious versus the secular, the religious versus the political, and so forth. And the goal of such a framework, of employing such a genealogy, would be to ask what secularism means historically. And this is the key word: what secularism means historically, how certain practices, concepts, and sensibilities have helped to organize in different places and at different times political arrangements called secularism. So, in other words, what we are doing essentially is contextualizing, historicizing what is supposedly universal, and so forth.
And so,
So,
Ali, just on that previous one, could you just explain a bit further what you mean by epistemic category?
so,
Why does secular fall into that?
so an epistemic category is a category that is related to knowledge or belief or the origins of knowledge and so forth. So the very idea of secularism presupposes a certain epistemology, and as I explained in the course, also presupposes a certain metaphysics. Now this is important because when we deal with secularism, we tend to treat it as a political ideal, and we neglect the fact that it has certain epistemological and metaphysical dimensions, which inshallah ta'ala I hope will become clearer as we proceed.
Yeah, are you also going to explain further what you mean by genealogy?
So genealogy really means to trace the origins of an
Okay,
idea, the ways in which it has undergone transformations, continuities, and discontinuities.
right. Okay, okay.
So through this framework, what we can demonstrate, as I will demonstrate as we proceed, inshallah, is that the category of religion and the secular are not two mutually exclusive categories. These are two historical, arbitrary categories that are created, that are constituted, as we will see, by the modern state. So then the question really becomes this: if the category of the secular and the religious are categories that are created, who are the question then becomes, created by who, right? Talal Asad brilliantly explains how the category and also uh, 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 cultural anthropologists and political scientists who followed in the wake of Talal Asad also point to a pivotal point in this presentation, which is that it is the modern state, it is the secular state that engages in the process of determining what is secular and what is religious, what falls within the purview of the political and what falls within the purview of religion. So, and this is essential to the very essence and the nature of the secular state, because the secular state must engage in a process of secularization, which is the indoctrination of its citizens and the need to transform religion to render them compatible with secular doctrine. As such, the state engages in what we can call a process of conversion. So when we speak of these two categories, we must always ask the question, and this is why it is critical for Muslims to be critical, because we have to ask the question: who creates these categories? Who defines religion? As we will see, inshallah ta'ala, it is the state that engages in the demarcation of the boundaries between the secular and between the religious. So an example of this is the International Religious Freedom Act, which, according to Sabah Mahmoud, illustrates how the exercise of sovereign power tends to subsume the secular principle of religious freedom. The RFA was signed into law under President Clinton in 1998 and gives unprecedented powers to the US federal government to expand its regulation of religious life on an international scale in the name of enforcing and protecting religious freedoms. So here we begin to see how the idea of secular neutrality begins to crumble. Because in engaging with the categories of the secular and the religious, the state must inevitably engage in the process of defining religion. Therefore, as we will see, the state becomes a theologian. The very act of determining what falls within the purview of politics versus religion is in and of itself a political decision. Now, to dive deeper into this, inshallah, to demonstrate the ways in which the secular and the religious are not two mutually exclusive categories, and how these categories are arbitrarily defined by the state, we can look at four different court cases. The first of which is Lautzi versus Italy, and this pertains to the Human Rights Council. So the case of Lautzi versus Italy is a case in which an Italian mother sued her children's public school for the compulsory display of the crucifix. She argued that the public display of the crucifix violated her children's freedom of thought and religion, which is protected in Article 9 of the European Council of Human Rights. The Supreme Administrative Court ruled against Lautzi, arguing that, and this is the interesting part, arguing that the crucifix did not have any religious connotation. Instead, it represented Italy's historical and cultural values. So in 2009, Lautzi appealed this to the European Council of Human Rights, who originally ruled in her favor. But then they reversed this decision after getting pressure from 20 secular states and the Vatican. And the ECHR, the European Council of Human Rights, essentially argued that the display of the crucifix was not an act of propagation that could influence students from one religion to another, but rather the crucifix represented Italian civilization and its value system, liberty, equality, human dignity, and its states, and accordingly also the secular nature of the state. So for the European Council of Human Rights, the crucifix, which we would take to be an ostensibly religious symbol, is taken to be a political symbol that represents Italian civilization, and they go as far as to claim that it represents the secular nature of the state. Now we can contrast this with the two other cases two other cases, Dahlab versus Switzerland, in which a former Catholic convert to Islam, Lucia Dahlab, was prohibited from wearing the headscarf while teaching at a public elementary school. Dahlab appealed to the European Council of Human Rights using the same article, arguing that this violated her freedom of religion. The court ruled against Dahlab, arguing that the hijab was, quote, a powerful external symbol. In other words, unlike the crucifix, the hijab was a religious symbol. And this set the precedent for other cases. So, for example, Sahin versus Turkey in 2005, where Layla Sahin was banned from medical school for wearing the hijab, which the Turkish state argued was a symbol of political Islam, and as such, it was a threat to the Turkish Republic's values. Sahin, like Dahlab, appealed to the European Council of Human Rights, which ruled in favor of the Turkish Republic, arguing that the hijab was a symbol of political Islam rather than a political obligation. The court stated, quote, the regulations on the Islamic headscarf were not directed against the applicant's religious affiliation, but pursued, among other things, the legitimate aim of protecting order and the rights and freedoms of others that were manifestly intended to preserve the secular nature of educational institutions. Lastly, the case of Dogru versus France, in which an 11-year-old girl, Belgian Dogru, was expelled for refusing to remove the hijab during physical education class. Her parents appealed to the ECHR, which ruled in favor of the ban, and they argued the court hearing the court essentially stated, quote, in France, as in Turkey or Switzerland, secularism is a constitutional principle and a founding principle of the republic, to which the entire population adheres, and the protection of which appears to be of prime importance in particular in schools. The court reiterates that an attitude which fails to respect that principle will not necessarily be accepted as being covered by the freedom to manifest one's religion, and will not enjoy the protection of Article 9 of the Convention. Having regard to the margin of appreciation, and this is a critical concept, margin of appreciation, which must be left to the members of the state with regard to the establishment of the delicate relations between the church and the state. Religious freedom, thus recognized and restricted by the requirements of secularism, appear legitimate in light of the values underpinning the convention. Now, the margin of appreciation is a doctrine used by the ECHR to consider which states that a member state has a degree of discretion in terms of determining the relationship between church and state and the laws that follow from it. The ECHR thus ruled that the banning of the veil was within the legitimate margin of discretion of the Turkish and of the French state. The point here is not to point out the hypocrisy, which is why would they consider the crucifix to be a religious symbol, whereas the hijab is a political symbol. So the point here is not just to point out that there's a hypocrisy or that there's a hostility towards Islam. There's a much more important point to make, which is that the definition of what is considered religious as opposed to secular is arbitrarily determined by the state. And again, this is best exemplified in the ways in which the crucifix was held to be a secular symbol when we know it to be an ostensibly religious symbol, whereas the hijab was arbitrarily deemed to be a religious symbol. So to dive even deeper into this, the ways in which the state arbitrarily determines what is religion, what is secular, we can look at French secularism, the French model. Now, through modernity, the state became sovereign. It became an abstracted, transcendent power, independent of rulers of the ruled, and independent of any divine power. If religion, as per defined by secularism, is concerned with otherworldly affairs, then the state must define the proper place of worldly well-being in the affairs of the populace. Now, the core feature of the sovereign state, be it the secular state of France or the United States, is that it must engage in the cultivation of a new self, a new subjectivity, a new form of identity that conforms first and foremost to the personality of the secular state. Now, the idea of the republic as an imagined community requires that there is some sort of internal enemy. Now, in the 19th century in France, this was primarily the Catholic Church, institutionalized Christianity. As of the 1970s and onwards, this became fundamentally the internal enemy became quote unquote fundamentalist Islam. Now, the image of the state as a sovereign and possessing its own personality, and in the face of internal threats, the state had to create its own signs and deal with signs that potentially disrupt its fabric, that disrupt the secular personality of the state. And so the banning of the veil is part and parcel not only of, so when you talk about the banning of the veil, it is not only because France has a certain hostility towards Islam, which it certainly does, and we will see this as we proceed later on, but because it is in the very essence of the secular state that it must confront signs that do not conform to the secular personality of the state. So this process of engaging in defining what signs are secular and what signs are religious, this is essential to the secular state. It is not an anomaly of the secular state. And we tend to treat it as an anomaly because we presume that the secular state is neutral. But what Talal Asad is pointing out here is that rather than being neutral towards religion, the secular state must engage in the process of determining what constitutes, what defines religion, what's defined as religion, and what is defined as a religious sign versus a secular sign, and
So,
so
so
forth.
just so Ali, so in essence, when you talk about the issue of the secular state being neutral, there's this idea that you have the secular state, and then you have all these religions and religious groups which are equidistant to each other and to the state. Yeah, they're all sort of competing interests or have, their own particular communities. And the secular state is this overarching thing that just sort of takes a step back and doesn't get involved in any religion. But you're
Exactly.
saying, no, the secular state doesn't just take a step back and, lets religions and religious groups practice how they want. It defines the religion that's allowed to express itself and what
Exactly.
type of things are called religious in itself.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And inshallah, when we later on in today's session, we'll dive deeper into this idea: is secularism neutral or not?
Yeah.
But for
But just
now,
yeah. So go now. Sorry.
no, no, go ahead, Akhi.
No. I was going to say because some people may say, look, the reason why the Italy allowed the cross to be worn or shown or whatever is because Western European societies grew out of this Judeo-Christian culture. It is part of the fabric that the societies are built upon.
Okay, exactly. But see, then that in and of itself is an arbitrary claim because it depends on who you're asking, right? And this is what we'll see later on when we proceed, when we talk about the issue of tolerance. Who gets to determine whether or not the crucifix represents civilization or whether it represents something that is ostensibly religious? And even if we were to argue that, okay, look, this is part of heritage, well, it is part of a Christian heritage. It is part of a Judeo-Christian foundation that gave rise to certain secular sensibilities and so forth. So even if we were to say that, okay, well, the crucifix is part of the fabric of Western civilization, then we will also have to acknowledge that it is part of the fabric of a Christian civilization. Therefore, it does have religious connotations. Now, the point here is not to argue whether or not the crucifix is a religious symbol or a secular symbol. The point is that we need to ask the question: who gets to determine whether it is religious or secular? And this act of determination, this political act, in what ways does it negate the claim to neutrality which a secular state claims to uphold?
Yeah. Jazakallah.
وإياكم. No problem. So, to deal with this issue of the hijab, this issue of the veil, this issue of signs, the French president set up a commission called the Stasi Commission to look into the issue of veiling in public schools. Regis Debray, a politician and member of the Stasi Commission, he went on to argue that the social contract of the secular republic was, quote, functionally equivalent to divine revelation. Now, several members of this commission, the commission that was formed to explore the question of the hijab in public schools, several of the commission members were also members of Le Comité La Cite la République, whose purpose was to preserve the principles of French secularism according to the website. Now, on the website of this committee, we find the following. The school is a sacred place of the Republic. Sacred place. So notice the wording here. Where one learns to become a citizen, where all children are taught to become free women and men, equal in rights and interdependent, regardless of their color, their origins, and their religious, philosophical, or cultural belonging. It is there that liberty, equality, and fraternity acquire their full concrete meaning, the school. That is why the school must remain a protected sanctuary, and with regard to secularism should never allow commercial, communitarian, or dogmatic interests to include. Now, here we find a contradiction. Here we find a tension between, on the one hand, this idea of individualism, which is central to the liberal secular project, and on the other hand, this supposed commitment to the secular state and the secular personality of the state. So, how does the secular state overcome this, or how does the French secular state overcome this supposed tension and this uh, contradiction? It is essentially through the idea that through schooling and through the processes of secularization that are enacted by the state, the individual will mature in such a way as to move beyond religion and move um, beyond superstition and so forth. So the state, in order for the citizen to attain this sense of maturity, this sense of uh, 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 realization and so forth, must be subordinated to the processes of secularization, which occur primarily, as the committee states, through school, which again the wording is interesting here, that the school is a sacred place of the republic where we learn to become secular citizens. The committee also states that today secular humanism alone can nourish and guide the march of all people towards knowledge, toward a better existence and justice, towards peace and freedom. So the for a secular state, this means that the state is given final authority to determine which signs are religious and which are not. This is not. This naturally led to a debate about the hijab, as we already explained, and he set up the commission. Now, the commission ends up essentially stating, or essentially publishing, a report banning any quote unquote conspicuous religious signs in public schools. These conspicuous signs were distinguished from discrete signs that were permitted, such as little crosses, stars of David, or miniature Qurans. There are two interesting points to be made here. First is that the Commission presumes a certain definition of religion in its designation of what is a religious sign. Second is the reduction of the hijab to a sign rather than being an obligation of faith. In other words, the Commission not only arbitrarily what constitutes religion, but also in a theological move determines the essence and the nature of religious acts. That is because it had to interpret the hijab as being a symbol that did not conform to the secular personality of the state. Now, the secular state even takes this a step further, in that, in arguing that the hijab is a sign of political Islam or of fundamentalist Islam, the state is also assuming the psychological processes behind the wearing of the veil. That is to say, the intention and the will of those who wear it. Thus, the state is as pervasive as to access the very private subjectivity of the citizen. In fact, the state. Okay, I'll leave this towards the end. I'll leave more of this towards the end, inshallah ta'ala. Um, but essentially, the idea is that when you come to state that the veil is a sign of political Islam, and that wearing it is a sign of fundamentalism, then essentially what you are arguing is that you have access to the intentions and to the motives of those who adorn the hijab. So the state is not only pervasive in that it determines what is religious, but also in that it claims to tap into the very subjectivity and intentions and motives of those who wear the hijab, as
Yeah.
if those who wear the hijab are trying to express some sort of affiliation to a political Islam rather than trying to fulfill an obligation.
Yeah, I suppose in essence that they look at the hijab as though the reason why the person's wearing the hijab is he's trying to undermine the woman's trying to undermine the secular republic of
Exactly.
France. Yeah,
Exactly.
so it's a revolutionary act as opposed to somebody who thinks to himself, "Well, I'm just fulfilling a particular obligation,
Exactly.
ordered by my religion." So, yeah, you're right. It's a very strange way of looking at it. And also, just as the point that you mentioned about schooling and how secular schools according to the Stasi report, are there to create and nurture a secular humanist individual. The idea, historically at least, the idea that's generally presented, and again, it comes down to that issue of neutrality, is that schools are just there to teach them the 3 R's, as we call it in England: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yeah, although they're not 3 R's, but that's what they call it. So, but yeah, what you're saying is no, schools in a secular society are doing something far more pervasive than that in terms of trying to mold a personality for the state, yeah, as a secular citizen of that particular state,
Yeah,
rather than just somebody just learning academic sciences or academic subjects.
exactly, exactly, exactly. So Talal Asad basically summarizes this by stating that the banning of the veil as a sign can therefore be seen as an exercise in sovereign power, an attempt by a centralized state to dominate the public space as a space of particular signs. Now, it may be argued that the ban of the veil was for the preservation of individual freedom. That is to say, to prevent families from imposing the veil on women, or to prevent gender discrimination. However, even a cursory analysis of French media reveals that the real reason behind the ban and the popular support for the ban was the idea of voluntary servitude. The danger was in that the hijab was voluntary. Um, the idea that young French women should themselves choose to wear the headscarf, the veil, the hijab, is precisely what makes them even more dangerous. This act, quote, is no longer to be seen as a consequence of family pressure, but as a sign of personal and therefore fanatical commitment. So, to summarize here, I mean, the reason I brought these court cases into our discussion, the question of the French state into our discussion, is really to illustrate the ways in which the state arbitrarily determines what constitutes a religious sign versus what constitutes a secular sign. And when we talk about this, when we say the secular, we are also referring to the political, right? Because secularism is thought to be the only mode of knowledge or mode of arrangement that ought to exist in the political space. So the point, I hope that's clear by now, is that these two categories are arbitrary categories that are defined and determined by the state, as we saw in the case of French secularism in its treatment of the hijab, or as we saw in the Laozi versus Italy case with the issue of the crucifix. Now we can take a step back and argue, okay, this is with regards to French secularism. What about other models of secularism, such as the Judeo-Christian model that prevails in the UK or in the United States? So here I would like to point towards um, the pervasive US imperial project of trying to define and identify the so-called moderate Muslim. And this project was encapsulated nicely in an article by David Kaplan, which is entitled Hearts, Minds, and Dollars. In an unseen front in the war on terrorism, America is spending millions to change the very face of Islam. So, what exactly is this project? The Muslim World Outreach Project, inaugurated by the White House National Security Council, the goal of which was explicitly transforming Islam from within. So, for example, one of these programs, the Muslim World Outreach Project, in conjunction with the Pakistani Ministry of Education, sought to establish new and moderate madrasas in Pakistan in an effort to combat the fundamentalist madrasas. The United States also established and funded a radio station, Radio Sawa, and a television station, Al Hurra, both of which promoted a more liberal Islam. There has also been a proliferation of international and multilateral initiatives led by the United States, including the Global Counterterrorism Forum and the Hidayah Center in Abu Dhabi, established in 2011. An example of such initiatives is an annual state-sponsored conference by the UAE called Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies. This forum was established in 2014 to counter the impact of the Arab revolutions. President Obama praised this forum and Sheikh Abdullah ibn Bayya as being one of its core members for leading the charge against extremism. Now, domestically, in 2015, the Bipartisan Countering Violent Extremism Act led to the establishment of the CVE office, the Countering Violent Extremism Office at the Department of Homeland Security. And essentially, their goal was to target any group or organizations with quote-unquote violent intentions. But what we found is they were targeting Muslims regardless of their affiliation. The FBI produced a model for confronting what they ambiguously dubbed jihadist ideology. Between 2012 and 2015 alone, the FBI and local law enforcement convened more than 2,500 engagement events aimed to foster trust, improve awareness, and educate Muslims about the violent risk factors in order to stop radicalization before it begins. So essentially, this idea of trying to identify the moderate Muslim and to try to confront the fundamentalist Muslim was also part and parcel not only of US foreign policy, but also US domestic policy, as we find in the programs that were led by the Countering Violent Extremism program. So to take this a step further, we can look at a report which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, that was released by the intelligence wing of the Pentagon, which is the RAND Corporation. So the RAND Corporation released a report called Civil Democratic Islam: Partners, Resources, and Strategies. The US, essentially through this report, the US State Department tried to develop relationships with what it deems to be the moderate Muslim. Now, the moderate Muslim is not defined in relation to his or her attitude to US foreign policy, but rather their position on scriptural hermeneutics. It is those moderates who want to reshape Islam as the Protestant Reformation reshaped Christianity. The National Security Division of the RAND Corporation released this report, Civil Democratic Islam, during the same year that the Muslim World Outreach Program was launched. The report essentially argued that what it dubbed to be traditionalism posed a more long-term threat than the so-called fundamentalists and the militants. The report states that the goal of the traditionalists, who are perceived to be a threat, was to, quote, preserve orthodox norms and values and conservative behaviors, and that these traditionalists, quote, have the Quran to be the literal word of God. So the report states, quote, modern democracy rests on the values of the Enlightenment. Traditionalism opposes these values. Traditionalism is antithetical to the basic requirements of a modern democratic mindset: critical thinking, creative problem solving, individual liberty, and secularism. Therefore, the only way to overcome traditionalism was through fostering this idea of moderate Islam, fostering the idea of a moderate Muslim. And essentially, this is a theological move, because for them, the traditionalist is problematic because he has a particular hermeneutics, right? Whereas the moderate Muslim has a quote-unquote enlightened hermeneutics. So here we see how the state engages in theology. The state must inevitably engage in a theological act in privileging one religion over another, or one form of religion, moderate Islam, over another. So what we can conclude from this, from beginning with Talal Asad's question about the genealogy of the secular, and through the 4 court cases which we explored, and looking at French secularism and its engagement with quote-unquote religious science, and then with this idea of the moderate Muslim, is what Talal Asad essentially states or concludes that, quote, there cannot be a universal definition of religion, not only because its constituent elements and relationships are historically specific, i.e. not universal, but because that definition is itself the historical product of discursive processes. In other words, what is defined as religion versus the secular is essentially a political decision. It is not, we cannot furnish any universal definitions of religion or universal definitions of the secular as the secular state presupposes in its very definition. So William Cavanaugh also explains this nicely or summarizes nicely when he states that what counts as religion and what does not in any given context is contestable and depends on who has the power and authority to define religion at any given time and place. And as we saw in the case of French secularism, this is essentially the state. So the state is essentially invested in the process of religion building, religion creating. One, in its self-determined ability to define what constitutes a religion. Two, in determining which beliefs and actions are deemed religious or alternative secular. And three, which of those religious beliefs and actions are acceptable to and tolerated by the state. Therefore, secularism is not reducible to the separation of church and state. The categories of the secular and the religious are created categories, they are not discovered categories. And three, secularism via the secular presupposes new concepts of religion, ethics, and politics. Now, Sawa Mahmoud summarizes this nicely when she states that secular liberalism cannot be addressed simply as a doctrine of the state or as a set of juridical conventions. In its vast implications, it defines in effect something like a way of life. Now, let's entertain this idea of okay, even if we were to take, let's entertain this idea that there can be some sort of universal definition of religion, right?
So, Ali, just wanted to ask a question because some people are going to say, "Hold on, the whole reason why America had to start talking about Islam and Muslims was because there were Muslims who were motivated by their religious faith to undertake acts of violence against America. So, they had to turn around and say, okay, we need to know what is a threat, what's criminal, and what's not criminal in this
Mhm.
situation, and
So,
therefore nip it in the bud type of thing."
okay, so that will be a legitimate claim if the idea of religion building and this hostility towards Islam was a post 9/11 phenomenon. But as I explained in the course, that the antagonism between Islam and the secular began as early as the 1820s, and that much of U.S. foreign policies after the 1820s was actually based on missionary reports conducted about Islam, which were sent to the U.S. government far before 9/11 or Islamophobia or any of these phenomena began to exist. So the class of civilization thesis and this idea that essentially Islam is a obstacle towards enlightenment is not a new phenomenon. It did not emerge after Islam became a quote unquote threat. It existed far before any groups like Al Qaeda or ISIS emerged.
I think also the other point, which is those things which are being seen as a political threat that needs to be investigated, particularly in the UK context with the CVE or the Prevent, as they call it here, which is countering violent extremism. One strand of it is called Prevent. Is that they look at things like, does a young adult male, does he start growing a beard? Does he start changing his dress? Does he
Mm-hmm.
stop drinking alcohol? Does he stop going to Christmas parties? They look at these, which are not illegal. That's the point. The point here is that it's not about legality and illegality, but they see them as precursors to acts of violence. As you said,
Yeah.
that they've looked at the intentionality behind these religious acts of
Yes.
devotion. Yeah.
Exactly.
Uh, so yes, I can see definitely in terms of that. But there's also another point which I was going to mention as well, or ask you a question about, which is, um, which was you mentioned the issue about the state it defines and delineates between the religion and what's not religion. Yeah. In that, are you meaning in terms of what's acceptable religion to what they see as a political threat?
Yes.
Yeah. So, for example, they would, because you mentioned about the cross. So you're saying, the example of the Italian case. Do they see that as a religious symbol, or do they see that as a cultural symbol?
So for them, the cross was perceived to be a cultural symbol that represented Western civilization, or even they went as far as to claim it represented the secular nature of the state. Now, there's an important point to be made here that when we talk about what religion is taught, which religions are tolerated, it is not only a question of threat in terms of security. It is also a question of what is a legitimate expression of a religion, right?
Right.
So the traditionalist, for example, does not pose a threat to US domestic security or US foreign interests. The traditionalist, right? The problem for them was that the traditionalist upholds a certain set of ideals that for them are oppose enlightenment ideals. So this idea of good Islam versus bad Islam, right? I mean, essentially, what the state is engaging in is trying to determine what Islam ought to be, or what Christianity ought to be, not only what Christianity or Islam is.
Okay. Just one other final before you carry on is that maybe the argument is used to say, well, Islam is unique as a religion because Islam isn't secular in the same way Christianity is perceived to be secular, or Judaism is perceived, or Hinduism is perceived, because Islam, by its adherents, they hold this view about politics and economics and how society should function. So therefore, it has to have a unique way of interacting with something, with a belief system that offers an alternative. It has different ideological outlook to secularism, unlike Christianity would have.
Mhm,
So they're saying, well, it's exceptional. The situation of Islam is exceptional.
mhm.
In essence, would they do this with other religions as well?
Okay, so they definitely did do this with other religions. So, for example, with Christianity, privileging a Protestant conception of religion over other conceptions of religion within different Christian denominations. The same thing, for example, in the British colonization of India, the ways in which it engaged with Hinduism. Now, that being said, yes, Islam is exceptional. And this is why, and I'm going to get to that, I'm going to get to this in a bit, inshallah, that secular identity was formulated and forged through a negative representation of Islam and through a hostility towards Islam, precisely because Islam was resistant to the processes of secularization. Islam did not recognize to God what is God and what to Caesar is unto Caesar, and so forth. So, yes, the secular state did engage in religion building with other religions, with other denominations, but it was Islam in particular that played a crucial role in the very identity formation of what is Judeo-Christian and what is secularism.
Right.
And we'll look at this in more detail, inshallah, when we look at um, secularism in international relations, inshallah. So now let us examine two possible ways of defining religion. The first is the substantive approach, which examines the content of religion. The second is the functionalist approach, which is more inclusive and examines the functions of religion. The substantive approach attempts to locate shared contact between quote unquote world religions. It often does this in reference to a belief in God. However, this was too restrictive, this idea that a religion has to have reference to God, because this meant that Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism could not be defined as religion. Thus, the argument was made that religion is that which is concerned with the transcendent. This, however, is equally problematic because the term transcendent is vague and ambiguous. For example, Confucianism does not uphold the idea of transcendence in the classical sense, nor did the Greeks believe that their gods were transcendent, but rather they were directly involved in natural social processes and fate. The most minimal definition of transcendence would have to be that which refers to any perceived transcendence. What has to mean anything that exceeds and unifies ordinary experience of the material world. Now, the problem with the substantive approach, is that in upholding the idea that religion is that which is concerned with the transcendent, then inevitably this must include certain secular phenomena. So the nation is regarded as being transcendent, the land is considered as being transcendent, humanism is considered to be transcendent, individual rights are considered to be transcendent. All are transcendent in the sense that, again, they exceed and unify ordinary human experience of the world. So, through the substantive approach to secularism, if we were to define secularism if we were to define religion according to the substantive approach, then we must include within its purview secular phenomena. So this leads to a collapse of the secular religious divide. So then the question becomes, okay, what about the functionalist approach? The functionalist approach seems like a more fitting category for scholars. The functionalist approach is not concerned with what our beliefs are, but how it functions in society and how it structures our social relations. The first problem is that in expanding the category of religion to include all ideologies, the category of religion loses any substantial meaning as everything comes to fall under its purview. The second problem with this inclusive approach, however, is that it must encompass supposedly secular phenomena such as nationalism. This means, once again, that the religion-secular divide collapses upon itself. What is to say, for example, that the secular phenomena such as consumerism, nationalism, Marxism do not function as religions? If this is so, does this not delegitimate the idea of the separation between the sacred and the secular? I mean, there's many examples of this. If we were to define religion purely in the functionalist approach, then we would inevitably have to take into account Marxism, nationalism, liberalism, and communitarianism, and other modes of other belief systems, and so forth. So again, if we were to define religion through the functionalist approach, this leads to a collapse of the secular religious divide.
So in essence, secularism itself, or the very secular ideologies itself, become religions.
Exactly. They become religions, and therefore, even if you were to try to find some sort of universal, let's say, even in the realm of academia, if we were to try to determine some universal understanding of what is religion through a substantive approach or through a functionalist approach, both these approaches lead to a collapse of the religious secular divide.
Yeah. So in essence, so a secular society would just basically means that their religion is dominant.
Exactly. And I explained, okay, so for sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but in the Sapiens Institute course, I go into explain how consumerism has become a religion, how nationalism has become a religion, and the ways in which the functionalist and the substantive approach are essentially inadequate in defining what is religion, because they will inevitably have to inevitably have to take into account secular religion, secular phenomena.
But is there any other ways that they try to define religion to try and escape this?
So these are the two dominant approaches that I am familiar with.
Yeah.
In terms of how they escape this tension and how they escape this problematic, well, this is precisely why in academia we live in a so-called post-secular age, right? So a lot of the claims of secularism and the claims of the secularization thesis, the idea of separation of church and state, these ideas no longer hold much weight in modern academia. Don't get me wrong, academia is thoroughly secular, but it is secular in a postmodern sense, not in a classical modern sense. So it's very difficult to find any scholars who will attempt to defend, academic scholars who will attempt to defend the secularization thesis or the universality of the secular. And a big part of this was the result of Talal Asad's intervention and the academic interventions that followed from Talal Asad. So that being said, let me move on to something else. Let me see if I should even go into this. Okay, so now to 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 continue with what we were saying about the ways in which the secular is determined by the state, what we can do is we can take another step back and look at secularism in international relations. And essentially to look at secularism as a product of historical processes. So Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, who's an international relations theorist, asks, how do processes, institutions, and states come to be understood as religious versus political, or religious versus secular? And how might we ascertain the political effects of such a demarcation? Her conclusion is, to define the boundaries of the secular and the religious is itself a political decision. Now, I want to conclude by looking at two fundamental modes of secularism, two models of secularism. The first is the Judeo-Christian model. The second is the laicist French model. So the laicist model is the belief that all metaphysical doctrines are no longer legitimate ways to govern the public sphere. It is, as Church Indian scholar puts it, a coercive process in which the legal powers of the state, the disciplinary powers of the family and the school, and the persuasive powers of government and media have been used to produce a secular citizen who agrees to keep religion in the private domain. This required the formulation of a, quote, independent political ethic that would serve as a common denominator for all citizenry, independent of religion. Now, we've already discussed French secularism, and I explained it at length in the course, so we'll move beyond that. Now, Judeo-Christian secularism, on the other hand, is more explicitly Christian in its origins. It does not seek to remove religion from the public space, but connects secularism to a Judeo-Christian legacy, a distinctly Western cultural value. John Stuart Mills, for example, states, it is therefore Jewish and Christian culture above all that a territorial people acquire the civilizational conditions of possibility for representational government. So like laicism, it was born out of a historical process, the core of which was the Reformation. The Reformation led to the creation of two categories, as we discussed, the spiritual realm and the secular realm. So to summarize, to put this in sufficient terms, the principle, Keane argues, another academic, that the principle of secularism, which represents a realization of Christian motives of Christianity itself, is arguably founded on a sublimated version of Christian belief that Christianity is the religion of religions, and that Christianity is entitled to decide for non-Christian others what they can think or say, even whether they are capable of thinking or saying anything at all. So in this narrative, secularism is supposedly the wonderful fruit of a Christian civilization, and that it is a distinctly Western achievement. So here we find a paradox in secularism. We find a contradiction and a paradox, which is, on the one hand, the claim that all religions ought to be secularized. All religions ought to conform to the principles of the Enlightenment and to discover what is rational and so forth. So that's the first claim, that we all ought to become secular. But on the other end, this model is also making the claim that secularism is essentially a distinctly Western phenomenon. So it seems that if you do not belong to this Christian heritage, you cannot become secular. But if you cannot become secular, and if you are fated to be non-secular, then this is essentially secularism loses its normativity. Secularism no longer determines what ought to be, what we ought to do, right? Because if you don't have this Christian heritage, then you cannot become secular. So this is one of the paradoxes of the uh, of Judeo-Christian secularism.
Isn't there also another issue? I don't know if you mention this later on, but the idea that if secularism is born out of Christian values, and then on the entailments of secularism is to sort of destroy Christianity, then under this Judeo-Christian secularism, that ultimately secularism will undermine itself. This is the whole like Jordan Peterson, worry about moving away from Judeo-Christian values because Western civilization is built upon it. So to move away from it radically or to completely dismiss it is to undermine Western civilization in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Anything more you want to add, or is that?
Can you just repeat the last point that you made about?
No,
I
I'm
got
just
the point
saying.
about Peterson, but I didn't get the
No, I'm
actual.
just saying. You say on you're mentioning this point about the sort of the essential problem, which is the fact that Judeo-Christian, the narrative behind it, yeah, is that this Judeo-Christian. Sorry, I've got the phone going off. The Judeo-Christian narrative is that Judeo-Christianity sort of created secularism, and that
Mhm.
if you're not born into that environment, then how can you say that this is sort of a universal way of life that people ought to follow? As you mentioned, it's descriptive
Mhm.
as opposed to normative. But there's also another problem, which is the fact that um, the implication of secularism is to sort of rubbish, dismiss religion, that Judeo-Christian culture in the first place. And if you're going to dismiss that at the same time believing that Western civilization was built upon that, was born out of that, then you're not undermining secularism in that sense.
I mean, there's a whole debate. There's a whole debate, really, essentially, about whether or not the Judeo-Christian heritage is fundamental to identity in a secular world. I mean, you can just look at the debates about the LGBTQ and about transgender rights in the United States and so forth. But I think if we engage with secularism as a historical phenomenon, we find that it was born out of a distinctly, and this is the point I'm trying to make, out of a distinctly Protestant conception of religion.
Right.
So the residue, the Christian residue, will always linger in secularism. It is
Okay.
not
Okay.
possible to overcome it, right? And I'll give an example of this when you talk about the European Union, inshallah.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so we explained that secularism is born out of certain historical processes, one of which is the arbitrary determination of what constitutes religion and the secular. There's another very important historical process that was involved in the creation of secular identity, which was its hostile representation of Islam, right? Its relationship to Islam. Now, first, it is important to understand that national identity is not a given self enclosed identity. National identity is not only determined by the we, but it is also determined by the not we. It is always constituted by an exclusionary discourse and an identification of what the nation is not. So, for example, when I want to define or I want to identify who I am, I can do so through differentiation by stating I am Ali, I am not Sharif. But I can also do so through exclusion, which is to say that I am Ali, I am superior to Sharif. I am human and Sharif is subhuman, for example. So identity formation can either take the form of differentiation or exclusion. With the modern state in its representation of Islam, it was through the process of exclusion. Uh, and I mean, there's many clear examples of the ways in which secularism was arbitrarily created in opposition to Islam, and I explore these
Yeah. But
in the
so
book.
Ali, are you saying in this particular point, is that Western states define themselves in part, at least in part, in direct opposition with Islam? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, historically, Western identity was formed and constituted through an opposition to Islam, and we see this going back to Montesquieu, John Stuart Mills, uh, uh, early American Protestant missionaries that were sent to the Arab world, and so forth. And I explore these in detail.
Yeah.
I give examples of these in the course.
Okay. Okay. No, it's good. Inshallah, to go to the course. But it just, on the face of it, sometimes it can sound slightly conspiratorial. I don't know
Mhm.
if you sort of get that, that impression that sometimes people may accuse that. Hold on, how can you say the West was so concerned with Islam that they defined themselves in its opposition?
So this is generally accepted now in academia. It's not a conspiracy. For example, we have Edward Said's famous Orientalism, right? This is why we live in a post-Orientalist age in academia. Um, I can refer the listeners to an excellent text on this topic titled "The Politics of Secularism in International Relations" by Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, or they can refer to the course for more
Yeah.
details on this.
There's also a good book, Joseph Massad. He discusses this very same point, Islam in liberalism, where he
Yes,
goes into detail
yes,
on this issue. Yeah,
yes. And I cover that in the course as well. Yes.
yeah. Okay, just okay.
So the Elizabeth Shackman Hurd argues that more than any other single religious or political tradition, Islam represents the non-secular in European and American political discourse. This is because secular traditions and European and American national identities and practices with which they are affiliated and through which they are embedded have been constructed through an opposition to Islam. Now, and this is precisely why Turkey, as Oliver, so to to begin with Oliver Roy's observation, quote, Turkey will be rejected from the European Union not because the Turkish Republic fails to satisfy the EU's demands to democratize, which would be a good reason, but because Turkish society is not European, meaning that it does not share the fund of Christianity that serves as a foundation of laicism itself. So this relates to the paradox, the contradiction which we established earlier, which is that on the one hand you ought to become secular, and on the other hand you cannot become secular because you are not Christian. But what is interesting here is that Turkey is a secular state. Under Erdogan, Turkey is a secular state. And yet, this mode of secularism is not acceptable to the European Union. So what this means is that not only is the dominant secular states of today, the Judeo-Christian model or the laicist model, right? So not only is it exclusionary in relation to religion, but it is also exclusionary in relation to other modes of secularism. So the question becomes, whose secularism is acceptable? The secularism of Erdogan is not acceptable to the European Union. Why? Because it does not conform to the Christian heritage, the Christian Judeo-Christian model of how secularism ought to look like. So this is another one of the paradoxes of the secular state, of the prevailing models of secularism. So this really summarizes the end of this is really basically my presentation. Um, if you have any questions, inshallah, we can engage them.
Yeah, no, alhamdulillah. So I think you've gone into quite a bit of detail in terms of really understanding and analyzing. Even though this is the teaser to your main presentation that you have, the main course that you give, gone into the idea about how you've got secular states that claim to be neutral, but really what they have is another form of religion that is dominant over other, over other religions, and particularly over the Islamic religion. But I just want to just go into this bit more detail in terms of the opposition to Islam,
Hmm.
because again, some people might turn around and say, yes, but why we don't look at Britain doesn't necessarily say that they look at themselves in opposition to the Muslim world. So how can we use that when they talk about British values in the UK? They don't say British values. They might list off some key points like democracy, rule of law, but what they don't say is opposition to Islam.
Hmm.
So
Okay, so let me
how do you? Yeah.
so let me clarify here. Here we're talking about the heritage of Judeo-Christian secularism, right? We are talking about certain concepts and ideas that are embedded in the history and in the historical formation of Judeo-Christian secularism. They don't necessarily have to be present in the present collective consciousness, right? Here
Okay.
we're talking about how secularism as a phenomenon came to exist in Britain and in the United States. And so it's only inevitable that certain memories will be forgotten from the collective consciousness. And this is why it is essential that we excavate them and make them known, so that the ways in which so that we can understand the ways in which present memories and present sensibilities have overlooked or forgotten certain elements, um, that are embedded within its history but are forgotten.
Yeah, and I think even though it may be forgotten in terms of the justification and the articulation historically, I think we see a lot of echoes to today. So, for example, on the one hand, you have the whole discussion around transgender
Yes.
and undertaking surgeries, and that being seen as a good thing. Yet at the same time, we talk about FGM being a terrible thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And yet both of them basically are the same essential thing, which is
Hmm.
mutilation or surgery upon certain genitalia. But on the one hand, it's celebrated or accepted or
Yeah,
considered to a certain extent normal. The other side, on the hand, it's not. It's seen as something backward,
exactly.
problematic. We need to say no. This is something we need to repel. And similarly, I think with regards to from the early 2000s after 9/11, 2002 invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq, etc., is we see this constant narrative that these Muslims are a threat to our way of life.
Yes.
Yeah, if we leave them alone, yeah, if we leave Afghanistan alone or Iraq alone, we will be threatened by them. Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's those constant, mirroring of, we need to be there to protect our freedom. If we don't protect, if we don't, we're not interfering with them, they'll come and they'll impose their, barbarism or whatever on civilization
Hmm.
upon us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of uh, this issue about Turkey, and you mentioned here, could it be argued that Erdogan, the reason why Erdogan has been prevented, or Turkey under Erdogan has been prevented from entering the EU, is because he does represent more Islamization within society, making Islam more visible as a symbol within society, and he doesn't represent the old traditional Kemalis.
Yes, that can be argued for sure. But even if we look at, for example, statements that were made by the U.S. State Department in the early 2000s, and even by certain European officials about the so-called AKP model, there's no disagreement that the model of Erdogan is a liberal secular model, right? It is a mode of liberal Islam. So any way we look at it, it is still secular. Now, does it represent a rise of religious phenomena in Turkey? Yes, definitely. And this is one of the reasons why it creates a hostility of the European Union towards Turkey, precisely because in many ways Erdogan represents a re-Islamization of society, or at least the phenomena of re-Islamization.
Yeah, and also the other issue is this: is that whereas the West and European states could never envisage themselves returning back to, the days of the church running and controlling the state, they would say, but we can't make the same type of prediction in regards to the Muslim world. So Turkey might be, secular today, but we don't know what it's going to be like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line. It might
Mm-hmm.
return back to the model of a khilafah, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, that's definitely one of the fears that I would imagine that one of the fears that the European Union harbors towards Turkey, right? But the question here is about a particular government in a particular historical time, which is the present, that the European Union is concerned with, right? So even if the European Union, even if Turkey were to become a khilafah, then okay, when it becomes a khilafah, it can be expelled from the European Union. The question is, why is it being prevented from joining the European Union now when it is secular, right? It can always be removed.
Right. Is there any final points that you want to mention, Ali? Alhamdulillah, we've been going over for about an hour and 16 minutes. Really
Check the
enjoyed the
course,
presentation.
inshallah. Check the course.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
This was literally this was literally a teaser. I mean, a full elaboration on all the points and on the questions that you have been asking are discussed in detail in the course, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. One thing that really sticks in my mind, Ali, that was that you mentioned, which was about this idea that, because often Muslims get criticized by saying, okay, do you want your religion to be dominant in society?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want everybody to follow your religion? And obviously, we know within the Sharia that actually not everybody follows the religion of Islam. That's not how
Mm-hmm.
it is. But it is dominant in terms of being the basis of the laws and governance of society. Even though each community of non-religious or a non-Muslim background, they may follow their own particular laws in their individual and personal matters. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
even marriage and divorce, etc. But what stuck in my mind is the fact that the manner by which academics define religion, then what you find is that secularism, particularly liberalism in the West, would fit within that definition of liberalism. Yeah. And as such, really, the discussion is not between a neutral platform, yeah, a secular platform, and Islam or some theocracy, as they say, but it's
Mm-hmm.
about competing religions.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that's
100%.
really how it's
I
framed?
think that's a very good way of putting it. Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So I think that's really important, because I think many Muslims feel always on the defensive on this issue
Mm-hmm.
about, oh, you guys want to establish them. What about other minorities? But then we're living in that situation, that scenario. It just happens to be the case that it's this secular liberal religion that's being established, and I think
Exactly.
more and more. To be honest, I think more and more for even for non-Muslims, they're seeing that because of the whole what they call the woke culture, the LGBT
Yes.
or the cancel culture, where people are being eliminated from public space because they're expressing something that seems to be going against what
Mm-hmm.
is seen as a particular brand of liberalization.
Yes.
Actually, I've got one final question, actually, because you mentioned how the secular state or the state defines the religion, and you
Mm-hmm.
gave examples in terms of America and Islam and fundamentalists and traditionalists versus modernists. But wouldn't it be the case that under an Islamic type of governance, that it would define Islam as well? And are we not just falling into the same issues with secularism?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think there's a fundamental difference here, that what constitutes Islam, what falls within the purview of the Sharia, or what we call the fiqh or usul al-fiqh and so forth, what falls within the purview of Sharia is determined not by the state in Islam, it's determined by the Sharia, and it's determined by the community. It is determined by the community of mujtahideen, the community of scholars. So the process of determining what constitutes religion versus the secular in Islam, or let's say the mubah, is determined organically from a community in a creative and dynamic fashion, and is not imposed top down by the state. I think
So in essence,
Wa
yeah,
al-Halaq explains this, for example, in the Impossible State.
yeah. So in essence, it's not the rulers may adopt a particular position, but they're adopting it from the community, from the
Exactly.
plethora of views within the community, as opposed to the rulers imposing what can be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's a follow-up question I had in regards to that point, which I think I've forgotten now. But I was just going to mention, in terms of, the fact that the ruler can adopt when there's multiple opinions and enforce that opinion as well.
Mhm.
But in that situation, even if they're adopting a particular position, like you said, it's not the ruler imposing it from top down, but rather he's adopting it from the Sharia and from what the community of
Exactly.
the Ummah has. And also the other thing which I think is really important to know is even with the ruler adopts a particular position within the fiqh, within the Islamic jurisprudence, the scholars who don't follow that opinion can still teach their own opinion and
Yes.
promote their own opinion as well,
Yes.
which is why we had Shafi'i scholars living within the Uthmani Khilafah, which was adopted the Hanafi fiqh,
Mhm.
and other such situations that happened throughout
Yes.
the Islamic history. Yeah, so which you would say would be different, wouldn't you, in terms of secularism? When
Yes.
secularism adopts, can you teach outside of secularism?
Well, I mean, there's multiple competing models, no doubt, but essentially, what's adopted has to fall within the purview of the Constitution, and the Constitution upholds one ideology over another, one orthodoxy over another, and that's what's essentially imposed.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. Anyway, I think
Yeah.
I don't want to rinse out too many questions and delve too much into the course that you're giving, but alhamdulillah, I'd really appreciate you coming on, Ali, and Jazakallah khair for the audience. And hopefully you like this new format where we go into more depth. Today's going to be on the issue of secularism. Inshallah, we'll be talking about some of the other more detailed topics we've got. We got actually, Ali, I don't know if you might be interested. We have a topic about the origins of the secular compromise, which you might find interesting. This idea,
That sounds interesting. Yeah.
yeah, because there's this idea that there was this intellectuals on the one hand and the religious clergy on the other, and there was this battle between the two.
That's a myth.
And
It's a myth.
yeah, it's a myth, and this is the point that he mentioned that the brother is going to present and discuss and say actually it was a political compromise, and this whole story about this competing between the clergy and the intellectuals, and it was some sort of intellectual discourse, and the secularists ran out. That was more of a post hoc justification of what occurred. So you might be interested in that. Inshallah, that'll be a show that'll be coming up soon. We're going to show also on quantum mechanics and modern cosmology and whether it challenges belief in a creator, as well as other topics on nihilism as well. So appreciate that. Jazakallah khair. Apart from the course, is there anything else that you want to mention, Ali?
I mean, for more information on some of these topics, you can check out my website, asharfouch.com. You can go to the article section, inshallah ta'ala, and I have a range of articles that dive deeper into some of the issues that we discussed.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Ali, I'll give salams, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to the audience as well.
حي